Good evening. This is CTV News for Thursday, August 6th. I'm Byron Scott.
And I'm Denise Douglas. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Governor Larry Hogan vows to maintain a campaign promise of legislative reform. Patricia Vallone is in Annapolis, where Hogan has just issued an executive order on redistricting. Here's the story.
This afternoon, the governor signed an executive order creating a reform commission on redistricting. The Redistricting Commission consists of 7 members, including retired federal judge and former Prince George's State's Attorney Alexander Williams. Now, members will also include policy research experts, as well as government reform and voter advocacy groups.
Well, here in Maryland, while I'm governor, we will no longer simply accept the status quo. This is about recognizing a problem and choosing to do the right thing to solve it. It's about encouraging fairness, checks and balances, and refusing the partisan politics used to suppress any real competition of ideas or any honest debate. It's Maryland's 3rd congressional district, which I believe has earned the distinction of being the worst drawn congressional district in the entire nation. In 2011, Judge Paul Niemeyer of the 4th U.S. Court of Appeals said the 3rd district was more reminiscent of a broken-winged pterodactyl lying prostrate across the center of the state.
Marylanders can also weigh in on the issues during public hearings across the state. Now, residents will also be able to vote on the constitutional amendment if it goes to referendum in 2016. From Annapolis, Patricia Vallone, CTV News.
Hogan says he plans to submit legislation to the General Assembly in 2016 based on the commission's recommendations. Meantime, one government watchdog organization says state legislatures are concocting new schemes that create barriers to voting.
Common Cause says those schemes usually target communities that are mostly black, elderly, or have large student populations.
That's right. Joining us now to discuss the issue is Jennifer Bevan-Dangle, Executive Director of the organization's Maryland office. Thank you for coming out and talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, what are your thoughts on the governor's new commission to take a look at redistricting?
We're very excited to see the governor following through on what was a promise he made in the State of the State. Our current district maps cut across our communities. They've been called a blood splatter or the pinwheel of death. There's nothing pretty about them, and there's nothing pretty about what they do to our democracy. So any reforms are a very important step forward.
How did it get this way in the first place? I mean, how did it get to be such a mess over all these years?
It's fascinating to see the evolution, particularly of that pinwheel district, the 3rd district, where it started fairly contiguous, respectful of Baltimore City lines, and has morphed into such a strange-looking amoeba. Part of it is the technology now. We can draw down into a cul-de-sac, separate the half of the cul-de-sac that's a Republican-leaning voters and the half that's Democratic-leaning voters, and put them in different congressional districts. So the technology is really what's enabled us to drill down and create these distorted shapes.
And kind of looking back at a little bit, the significance of the Voting Rights Act, what impact do you think it has had over the last 50 years?
The current maps were actually brought to court for discriminating against minority communities. If you look particularly at the 4th district, which is heavily African American, but was drawn out into Republican parts of Anne Arundel County, very different communities from its core, that was challenged in court. The judge unfortunately said there weren't enough standards to rule on it, so there was nothing the judge could do, even though he's the one who said it was drawn in a very painful way.
So this is the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
We had an amendment that should have taken care of this in the Constitution. Why did we need this act?
The Voting Rights Act was a pivotal piece of legislation. Despite the constitutional amendment to treat all citizens equally, very insidious legislative reforms popped up. Poll taxes, grandfather laws, every clever, devious scheme that could be devised to restrict certain people from voting, particularly African American populations. What's unfortunate is that since the Supreme Court has struck down pieces of that law just last year, we've already seen a renewal of this systemic ability to minimize people's voices, certain communities' voices in our voting process.
And specifically when it comes to Maryland in terms of steps to restore voting rights to former inmates, for example, can you expound a little bit on that?
Yes, Maryland took a very important step forward last year we clarified the process by which formerly convicted felons would regain their ability to vote. Under current law, if you've served your time, returned to your community, but you're still in some form of probation or parole, it's impossible to know when your right to vote is returned to you. So a former felon is left in the lurch. They want to be part of their community. They want to take on that civic duty, the most important civic duty, but there's nobody who can say, yes, you legally may do so. The law would have clarified it and said when you return to your community, when you're once again participating in civic life, that's when you get your civic rights back. Unfortunately, that law was vetoed, and we have to have a push now to override the veto next year.
There's a big debate tonight with Republicans. Are you hoping this issue comes up?
We certainly hope there'll be more attention to democracy issues, voter access, voter rights, the role of big money in politics. These aren't one party versus another. These are affecting everybody.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
And there will be a rally tonight in Baltimore called Unlock the Vote in Maryland. Supporters are calling on the General Assembly to override Governor Hogan's veto of legislation that would reinstate the right to vote for former prisoners. Participants can gather at 5:30 in McKeldin Square, located at Pratt and Light Streets. From there, the group will march to Thurgood Marshall's statue at Pratt and Hopkins Place. Well, today marks a significant day in American history. It was 50 years ago today that President Lyndon Johnson signed the landmark Voting Rights Act into law. Now, that measure guaranteed that black people would have the unencumbered right to vote, a right that had already been guaranteed by the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, but denied for decades by jurisdictions hiding behind the banner of states' rights. There are events taking place all across the country commemorating the day. A half-century later, many Americans say voting rights in America are being rolled back thanks to the 2013 Supreme Court decision striking down a portion of the law that was designed to keep certain provisions in place in certain states.
You know, Voting Rights Act is, it's a beautiful thing, but I just have a question. How come it's not a permanent right and it has to be renewed? We seem to be the only group of people here in this country who don't have the right to vote, as citizens of America. So why is that the case? How come we just can't ratify it one time, have it done, and not have to keep renewing this act?
Lawmakers are also weighing in. Congresswoman Donna Edwards among those of her colleagues asking to restore the protections that she says are still necessary.
Well, it is a big night for Republican presidential candidates since it is the first time that they will be debating for the 2016 campaign. All eyes will be on Donald Trump, who seemingly has stolen the spotlight with all the media attention he's gotten in recent weeks after making comments on immigration and other issues. The debate will be broken down into two parts since the 17 candidates can't fit on the same stage during the same time slot. At 5 p.m., Fox News Channel will broadcast an early debate. Then at 9 o'clock, the second set of candidates will hit the stage.
And fire investigators need your help in identifying two persons of interest. Now take a good look at this picture. The men seen here were observed in the Bladensburg area on the night of July 5th near the Easy Mart convenience store on Emerson Street. Now that building was damaged following a loud explosion at around midnight. For now, the men are just wanted for questioning. Anyone with any information is asked to call 301-77-ARSON. And you are watching CTV News. I'm Byron Scott.
And I'm Denise Douglas.